When they said to me, oh, you've got to make an entry for the Oscars, I said, oh, well, don't be stupid. No, they said, you really have to. And in those days, the composer had to sort of send in their own cue sheets, and you had to make your own entry for the Oscars. So I thought, oh, well, this is a waste of time, you know, I sent it off. And so that was a big surprise. There was never any question in my life that I would always do music. There was never any plan B. It was just music that was the thing that I wanted to be my life. And so I went to the Royal College of Music in London and did 3 years there. And then I did a master's degree. And I thought at one stage that I would do academic music. Maybe I would teach in a university or something. But actually, it's not really me, because in the evening I was still playing in the bands. And that was more fun. So then I left college, and like a lot of people leaving college, you wonder what the hell you're going to do. I had a number of really good opportunities and really good breaks. There was a children's programme on the BBC called Play School, and they employed pianists to play live for the presenters, to sing songs. And at the age of about 22, 23, I got myself on the list as one of these pianists. It was well paid, and that sort of gave me an in into professional music, and meant that I didn't have to sort of seek out every single job that was going, and that was like a safety net, really. I was still playing piano, and by that time, electric keyboards, electric piano synthesizer, and I met Trevor Horn, the producer, who was a bass player, and he was a freelance bass player, and we met playing in a band in a nightclub. He was getting into production, and he was looking for a keyboard player, and I was really keen on making records and doing studio music. I was fascinated by how a record was put together in a studio, and thought that that would be a great thing to do, to be part of a classic record somehow. By about the early 1980s, I was doing quite a lot of work with Trevor in studio, and we were lucky enough to have quite a lot of hits. It was certainly a golden age for the record industry. People bought records. Imagine that. Paying for music, wow. And one of the big successes that we had was in 1982 with a record called The Lexicon of Love. It was a group called ABC, and it was a massive record in that year. In the studio, there was a team of people working with Trevor Horn, a very fine engineer called Gary Langan, a programmer called Jonathan Yen-Charlick, and I was doing the keyboards and arranging and sort of musical things. And we were sort of team, and we would start experimenting with sampling, which was in its early days in the 1980s, 1982, 83. And after the bands had gone home, we would sort of experiment with using samples and cutting things up and doing quite experimental music. And I was aware of the experimental music that composers like John Cage had done in the 50s, when they literally cut up bits of tape and put them back together again. But with the sampling instruments of the 80s, you could do that quite easily. Things which would have taken a day, you could do in half an hour. So, you know, we made great strides, really. But Gary and Jonathan were very into the hip-hop beats of the time. So, you know, I'd do all this experimental stuff, and they put on these hip-hop beats. We never really had any commercial ambitions, but people seemed to like it. A very influential fan was Chris Blackwell, who was the legendary owner and entrepreneur of Island Records, and he wanted to release it, and came up with this great name thanks to Paul Morley, Art of Noise. And then suddenly we were a band, we were a thing, but I'd never really thought about being in a band. It wasn't commercially orientated. it was quite a shock when we released something and it went up the charts and we had to go on top of the pops. And we didn't know what to do on top of the pops because basically we just stood behind keyboards and played things. So, it was quite strange. We were doing all this experimentation and we did a lot of... People think it's very programmed and almost like the computers wrote it. But it was not like that at all. It was almost like a sort of free jazz. Gary would set the tape going and JJ would sort of have this machine called the Fairlight, which is a sampling instrument. He'd set it going, get some rhythms going, and I'd sort of improvise things over the top. And Gary would end up like with 20 minutes of improvisation, which he'd hone and cut together and make into something. With instrumental music, it's always very difficult to know when is it finished. You can always put another line on, you can always add another layer. And so in many ways, I think our first stuff was always in process of being added to. It was never really finished. But then we released this album. It had Moments in Love on it, Close to the Edit, Beatbox. These tracks have become quite almost sort of classics in their genre. From then on, lots of bands started to sample us. And then we sort of went a little bit more commercial because we actually began to enjoy the fact that you could make money from this and you could sell records. And so there's then a little bit of pressure. Can you do us a hit single? And we did a great track with Dwayne Eddy, the guitarist, legendary guitarist, called Peter Gunn, which was quite a big hit. Then we did a tour, and for a few years, it was sort of my full-time job being in the Art of Noise. We did quite an ambitious tour as Art of Noise. We went from East to West America. We started in Philadelphia and ended up in Los Angeles, I guess. Probably about 3 or 4 weeks. Then we went to Japan and we did a gig at Hammersmith Odeon in London. But Art of Noise was never really supposed to be a live band. And it was quite difficult because in those days we felt that we ought to do it all live. We didn't want to, what we saw as cheat by having anything coming from pre-recorded tapes. And so the drummer had a kit which was called a Simmons kit, and it was a kit of pads, and each pad had a different sample on it. And so he could have different sounds for each. He had a little sort of programming thing, and he could put in a different disc for each tune, so different drum sounds on each tune. But it was really sort of technically pushing the boundaries. And when you're travelling around from place to place, things did occasionally go wrong. And then he'd start playing and no sound came out. It was a bit stressful, but, we enjoyed it. We were, in our 20s. It was great. It was fun. We saw places we hadn't been before, places we probably never would go to, the middle of America. In those days, you did a tour to promote your records, and it was accepted that you would lose money on a tour, and we lost a lot of money on the tour, and we had to think, this is not really working anymore. And really, what we'd done, which was so experimental in the mid-80s, within 5 years, everybody was doing it, everybody was using samples, and it was much more difficult to be innovative and to make sounds that nobody else could do. So we sort of just faded away, really, in the early 90s. We had our biggest hit was in 1990 with Tom Jones. We approached Tom Jones and said, would you like to do a cover of Prince's song Kiss? And to our utter astonishment, he said yes. That was great. It was a big hit. It did us a lot of good. I think it did him a lot of good too, because he speaks about it very fondly as the time that he sort of got back into being hip. In the late 80s, early 90s, he was mostly doing cabaret at Las Vegas. He hadn't had a hit record for a long time, and he wanted to have a hit record. And we gave him a hit record, and so from then on, his career through the 90s and the early 2000s was massive. I've kept in touch with him. He did a song for us on the full Monty, and he's been great. He's been a great friend, yeah. A lot of filmmakers found our music from Art of Noise and put it on their films. And so after a little while, we began to be approached by filmmakers who wanted us to write stuff for them. And we got offered a few films. This is something I'd always wanted to do and had no idea how you actually got into it. So this was a great way to start writing film music. First film that we scored as a band was called Disorderlies, which was a comedy which almost nobody has seen. It has its moments. And I liked the whole process of doing the film, meeting with the director, going through the film and deciding what the music should do and where the music should be. At the same time, I'd also started doing quite a lot of commercials, because in the late 1980s, Britain was a fantastic place to make really groundbreaking commercials for TV. And we had directors like Ridley Scott and Hugh Hudson, Adrian Lyne, Tony Kaye, making adverts. And they would make these mini sort of epics, 60 seconds, 90 seconds maybe, max. And lots of music was required. And so I began to work for an agency who provided music for adverts, and I met lots of interesting people, explored lots and lots of different styles for adverts, from jazz to country to classical to hip-hop, and it was a great learning experience, how to express something in a very short period of time in a commercial, how to immediately cut to the essence of what's trying to be expressed, how to express it musically, and how to make it all coherent as a piece of music that may only last 30 seconds. It's really valuable. There was creative teams in the 80s in ad agencies. Sometimes they were a bit mad, really. I think they were completely mad, or maybe they took too many drugs, because they would give you the weirdest briefs sometimes. Some guy said to me once, "I want it to sound like God wrote it." That's quite hard. And then some other guy said, "I want any sound in this piece of music, I never want it to have ever been heard before. I want every single sound to be completely original." Yeah, okay. This is the thing about what I do, and what I've always had to do working in the film industry, is you're working with people who are not musicians. They have great ideas, but they can't express them in musical terms. So my job is to interpret what they say and to try and give them what they want. To be a translator, in a way, to understand that when they say they want it to be green, I have to interpret that in musical terms. Some composers don't like doing that. And also you have to be prepared to revise your ideas endlessly and go back and revise and edit. And you have to keep fresh every time and not sort of just lose heart. And sometimes people would say, "No, that's completely wrong, that's completely wrong." But actually it wasn't completely wrong, just one little aspect of it was wrong, but they couldn't really express what it was they didn't like about it. So again, you have to delve deep and ask questions and try and understand what people are trying to tell you. There's a bit of psychology involved. You have to be confident. Sometimes when you really think that the idea that you have is the right idea, I have occasionally really stood up for it and said, let's see this through. Let's take a breath and just let this idea grow on you for a little while. One of the problems that composers have if they work in the film industry is people put on temp music, which is music that they've gathered from wherever, anywhere, Hans Zimmer, Beethoven, Vivaldi. and they put it on the film just because they want to have music on the film. And then they give it to a composer, but actually they've heard that temp music for weeks, months even. And then they have to take the temp music away, the composer has to do something different, and they get scared of it for a little while, maybe. You know, they have to stand back and say, oh, okay, this is different music to the same pictures. Let me try and understand what that music is doing. So here we are, maybe we're in the 1990s. I'm doing work as an arranger. I used to do a lot of string arrangements for people, so I did string arrangements for Elton John and Rod Stewart and the Pet Shop Boys, loads and loads of string arrangements. I'm doing work as a keyboard player in things. I'm doing work with commercials, and I'm looking to get a break into film, really. And I always liked the magic of music and pictures. Something happens to the pictures when you put great music on it. Something happens to the music when you put great pictures on the music. That's something I wanted to understand. Why does that happen? Why does the same piece of film look different with two different scores on it? This is of endless fascination. That's why it's quite difficult to ever finalise a score, because you think, oh, I'm going to try something different on that scene, and it will work. There is no rules. If you take, Hitchcock, you know, the famous Psycho where she's driving, she's just a woman driving a car, she looks a bit worried, but you put the music on it, oh my God, what's she driving away from, what's she driving to? It's terrifying. As a curious musician, you really want to be involved in that, because it's the art form of our time, isn't it? Music and pictures. So I want to be part of that. I did a film for Neil Jordan called The Crying Game. It was quite a low-budget film at the time, and we didn't know if it would do any business. And it became a huge hit in America, The Crying Game, and it won Oscars. You know, that sort of gave me a calling card. It set me on my way. I did a few other things, and then in the mid to late 90s, 1997, I did a film called The Full Monty, which became a legendary film. But it didn't seem so at the time, because it was a low-budget British film. And I thought it was great. I thought it was really, really funny. But I had no idea that the humour would really translate into other cultures and other languages. Yeah. We weren't sure when we were making it if it would be a big hit. And we were all very surprised when it really made a huge splash worldwide. The other big hit of that year was Titanic. Our film had cost £2 million to make, and Titanic had cost £200 million to make. And we were all, we were all in the same category. When they said to me, oh, you've got to make an entry for the Oscars, I said, oh, well, don't be stupid. No, they said, you really have to. And in those days, the composer had to sort of send in their own cue sheets, and you had to make your own entry for the Oscars. So I thought, oh, well, this is a waste of time, sent it off. So that was a big surprise. Since then, I've done lots of films, lots of TV, kept working, done some interesting things, done some classical music, done my own thing, and still fascinated by film and music. It has been a diverse career, but I think film and music sort of suits me. I'd like to think that you wouldn't put me in a category, because I don't like categorising music. I don't like it being pop music or classical music or jazz, because it's all music, and I don't like these boundaries between music. In the same way as every film is unique, so you're trying to find something in the soundtrack that is unique to that film, some sound or some rhythm or something that will really suit that particular film. And you don't just recycle stuff from stuff you've done before. Everything is a unique challenge. There's no doubt that a fine score on a movie will be an incredible asset to the movie. And people are writing much more avant-garde scores now. There's a film called Poor Things, I don't know if you've seen it. It has a very avant-garde score. There's no tunes in it, but it has really sort of very up there. It's conventional instruments, it's woodwinds and strings, but they're all played in a very weird way. But it suits the film beautifully. It's perfect for the film. And then there's more mainstream films which need a more mainstream score. Things will evolve. Things will always change. People are always looking to do new things. There's always that director who wants something that nobody's ever heard before. I did a children's film at Christmas for a streaming service. It was so refreshing because the director said, oh, you know, we're not reinventing the wheel. I want something that will sound really good in 25 years' time, in 30 years' time, and would have sounded great 25 years ago. So I tapped into this incredible sort of wonderful mainstream idea of writing a theme and having the piano, and it was just very conventional and, you know, very sort of emotional in a traditional way that children could relate to, anybody could relate to. And that was very refreshing. When I first started learning the piano, I discovered that I had perfect pitch, which means somebody can play a note and I know what it is. Now, I don't know how that happens, and I don't know why that happens, but I guess something when I was first learning music went in that way. Somebody must have said, well, this is a C, and as well as looking at it on a piece of music and seeing it on a keyboard, I also understood the sound of it, and that went in. And so this sort of natural affinity with music means that if I'm hearing a piece of music, I'm also seeing it written down and I know what the notes are. Now, I thought everybody was like that. And then I found out that that is not the case. When I was 7 or 8, I just thought, oh yeah, that's okay. And then when I was about 10 or 11, my music teacher, when we were doing the tests, you know, the oral tests and things, she discovered that I had perfect pitch. And she said, oh, that's incredible, you got perfect pitch. And she thought, oh, that's very special, you know. And I thought, oh, okay. But I suppose subconsciously, maybe it made me think that this is something. Well, I don't know. Actually, I never thought it was anything, to be honest. I just thought, well, it's just the way it is. But it means that the language of music seems to speak to me in a very clear voice, shall we say. I was very lucky in my music education, I think, because when I was about 12, I was able to get this grant, this exhibition, to go to the Royal College of Music on Saturdays for my music lessons. And I had excellent tuition there, including theory of music. And I remember one particular morning, this wonderful teacher played a Bach fugue, and a lovely piece of music, great piece of music. He played it on the piano. Then he explained how it was all put together. How you had this theme, and then this other theme, and then the first theme would be put upside down and back to front, and then the first theme would be with the notes twice as long, and then this theme fitted with this theme, and it was like putting together a tapestry. And it was the first time that I realised that music wasn't just a question of putting one note after another, that it had this structure, that it had this architecture. And it was a revelation, and I thought, oh, there's quite a lot to this. And at that stage, I was probably about 13, 14, I thought there's so much more I've got to learn because I had no idea about this. It was a very interesting moment. That was one of those real revelatory moments. Every time you write a piece of music and play it to somebody, you're exposing your emotions, your soul, if you like, and it's a bit scary. It never really quite goes away. And then when I take a piece of music that I've carefully orchestrated and carefully arranged, and I go to the studio and I set it in front of musicians, there's a little bit of a frisson, a little bit of, I hope this is going to be all right. Because you never really know. You can do all the preparation in the world and then something happens and you think, that didn't quite sound like I wanted it to. I think I've got enough experience now that if it doesn't quite sound like I wanted it to, I know how to fix it pretty quickly, and that's a benefit of technique and experience. But it doesn't go away. I don't think you ever know if something you've done is going to be a hit or successful. I mean, you need to think it is, because you need, at that stage when you're working on it, to believe that it's good. Lots of things that I've believed were very good did not go on to be hits. And some things that I believed were a bit average did go on to be hits. So it's very difficult to know. And there's lots of other factors at play, marketing, timing. You never know if you're going to be lucky enough to do that. I'm just about to go on tour with ABC to tour the Lexicon of Love, and we take an orchestra with us. Well, I say we take about 30 people in the orchestra, and all sorts of things happen every night. There is this adrenaline that you can enjoy when you're on stage. Adrenaline on stage is a fantastic chemical, I suppose, and it keeps you going, and you're able to deal with things that go wrong. It's what I particularly enjoyed about playing jazz, although, as I said, I'm not a great jazz player, but the whole point of jazz is you don't know what's going to happen, and people are improvising. You're going to do an extra chorus, which you hadn't thought you were going to do. The drummer's going to do something completely different on this. The bass player's playing slightly different notes than they usually do. You adapt to it, and you find something in your own musicality that means that you can do something that you hadn't anticipated you were going to be able to do. That's great when that happens. Film composition has to be very organised and precise, because I'm trying to hit precise sync points. And it's one of the reasons that I like to write music which isn't film music, to write classical music and my own music, because I don't have to hit all these sync points and be constrained. Sometimes the film might constrain you. You think, I wish this scene went on much longer because I like this piece of music. I want to see what would happen if I developed it a bit further. If you say, I really need the music to go on another 4 bars there, could you give me a bit more at the end of the scene? That's not ever what they think about. It's really quite occasionally, somebody will give you that leeway. But so many other things seem to come into play when they're editing a film. There's so many producers involved in editing films now who really, the music is just something they stick on, and they don't really understand that it needs to have its own integrity. I'm quite happy to read a script, but I'd really rather see some sort of rough edit, because visually what it looks like is going to be very influential. What's the production design? How are the actors? How fast is the editing? What's it like? Get an impression of the film. And then I'll think. Then I like to sort of go out and wander around and listen to the birds and, walk through the trees and things. If I'm lucky, something will occur to me, and the picture of what I want to achieve might come quite quickly, like a flash of lightning, lighting up a landscape, and you think, yes, that's what I want to do. And it comes quite quickly, and then your job is to find the tools you need to get to achieving that. And that might take a while. It's quite difficult to explain, but in your mind, you know what you're trying to get to. You just need to find the arrangement, the combination of instruments, the sounds, the rhythms, so that you can get to that point. A lot of the times I would start on the piano and I would trust my hands to find something interesting, because I play the piano every day, I play all the time. Other people's music, mostly. And so, there'll be somewhere that I want to go. Sometimes if I want to do something that's a bit more abstract, I'll try not to start on the piano, because I maybe want to be a little bit more left field in this particular instance, and the piano might lead me into a rather more conventional sound world. It depends on the project. I'm mostly happiest if I'm starting on the piano and trying to find some melodic riff, motif, something to build on. Yes, I think so. It's me and the film and the music. I mean, the director, what they've said to me is important, and they may not have always expressed their ideas musically, but there might be something that they've said, some sentence that I'll mull over and I'll think, what do they mean by that? And see if that can be interpreted in a musical way. It's difficult to say. I mean, if you're working on a full-length feature film, you really should have at least 6, 8 weeks, 10 weeks. Sometimes you don't get that long. Music's the last thing that gets put on. They're still doing the editing quite up to a late stage now. When is it finished? Okay, when is it finished? You have to be satisfied that it's doing exactly what it needs to do. There's always a temptation to put on another line here, to put on another counter melody, to reinforce this bit with a French horn, to put on a guitar. You just have to use your taste and your judgment and your experience to know this is as good as it's going to be, stop. I wouldn't think of a melody in abstract. If I was to think of a melody, I would be thinking of how would I orchestrate this melody? This melody is going to be a flute, or this is going to be an oboe, or an oboe and a clarinet together, whatever. I wouldn't have it in abstract. When I'm playing the piano, I'm always hearing the orchestra anyway. And when I play people a demo on the piano, and I say to them, well, this is going to be the orchestra, I think that they can hear it the same way as I can, but they can't. I've learned that. People, when they hear a piano, they hear a piano. They don't hear an orchestra. I do. That's the difference. In almost every case, I'll orchestrate my own music because I think the orchestration, the actual arrangement, how it sounds is so much integral to the concept of the music that I wouldn't like to give that to anybody else to do. It gives me a lot of work, it's very hard work, laborious. You've got to literally write every note for every instrument, from the flutes down to the double basses. I think it's probably like the painter painting the colours in their picture. They've got the outline and then they do the colour. And that's got to be the fun part, hasn't it? I think I really enjoy it. I always enjoy it. And it's a whole art, the art of orchestration, that I think you can never stop learning about. Because every time you hear a great piece of music that's been written by a great composer, you think, well, how did they get the orchestra to sound like that? What are they doing? What are the instruments doing that I've never experimented with before? It's a continuing interest of mine, and I continue to get scores and look at the way other people do it and try and learn things. Imagine John Williams' scores without the wonderful colours that he puts in them. You can't, can you? The orchestra has to sound like that for it to be sounding like John Williams. In orchestration, you make decisions every bar. Every single bar, you're making hundreds of decisions. Is the flute going to play this? If the flute plays, what note's it going to play? Is the oboe going to play the same note as the flute? Oh, maybe it's going to be an octave lower. What's the clarinet going to do? Maybe the clarinet can do something different. And that's before you've even got down to the horns and the brass and the percussion and the strings. It's decision-making all the time. It's not something that I can even sit and analyse, because if I was to analyse, it's ridiculous, the amount of decisions that you're making. I guess it's like when you're driving a car. You're making so many decisions all the time, aren't you? But you're not thinking about it. It becomes automatic. I quite like doing long-running TV because it's a lot more hours than a film, and you get a lot more opportunities to develop ideas. Well, even the longest film is not going to be much more than 3 hours. But Poldark, we did 5 series, I think it was 42 hours of Poldark. And that's a long distance to travel with the music. And so you can afford to really sort of develop it in a way that you couldn't in a film. If you were to be derogatory, you would say I was a bit of a control freak, because I like to be in control all the way through the process. I don't let the orchestration go, I don't let the production go or the mix or anything. Every aspect of it is important. I like to follow it through. We've orchestrated it, we've gone to the studio, we've recorded it. I will probably conduct the orchestra, and so if there's questions, I'm dealing with the questions. And then we make the mix. We'll do the mix, and then we let it go, because then it goes to the dubbing theatre and somebody else mixes the music in with the dialogue and the sound effects. It's always a good idea to have some other performers. You're getting their energy, you're gathering up their own artistic creativity and their musicianship, and they bring something to it always. It's great. Each one of them will be slightly different and they'll play it slightly differently, but it's all viable, and you can sometimes get things out of people's mistakes. You know, they play something slightly wrong, and we used to do this in Art of Noise all the time. The mistakes were great. We would always embrace the mistakes. I sort of follow through the idea right to the end, because it's not over until it's over. You have to see it through and finish it. I might have had this great idea of what sound I wanted to get to, and I've gone through the process, and I've written the music, and I've orchestrated the music, and I've recorded the music. But unless I'm also in charge of the mix, I might not achieve this thing that I wanted to get to. The whole process has to be followed through to the end. That's not to say that I don't hugely value the input of everybody else who works with me, engineers and programmers and musicians. You know, that's all extremely important. Sometimes you need a bit of time, and I like to do a mix and then go away from it for a day and then come back to it fresh. Because if you're mixing all day, you do lose a little bit of objectivity, and you come back the next day or the day after and you think, oh, why are the drums so loud? And you sort of lose sight of that when your ears get a little bit tired. Ideally, I would consider it over a number of days before I finalise a mix. At that stage, things are only going to get better. If you've got to the mixing stage, you should have really done all the work. I don't like to fix it in the mix. I know some people do. Some people record all sorts of stuff. They end up with 96 tracks of stuff. Nothing fits together, so they have to sort of edit it at that stage. Not me. Can't do that. Ideally, the director's involved all the while and will come to the final mix. That's always very valuable. And then, of course, they're the person who takes it then to the dubbing stage, which by this time I'm not involved, and mixes all the other elements into it. So it's quite important that they're in touch with the music.